You've seen the thumbnail already, you already know what's going to happen here, and yes, we made edge highlighting worse.
Let's kick it off with my new obsession, the RGB Marine. Technique-wise, it's a pretty simple idea, but it does mean we have to knuckle down on one of the most tedious things in miniature painting, edge highlighting. The best way to break down edge highlighting is exactly what it is. It's in the name. You are highlighting the edges. A lot of people give the advice of using the side of the brush, and look, that does work pretty well in most cases, but there's a lot of times it can't be avoided. You will have to use the tip. That's what she said. And with that in mind, there's really only two things I can suggest to help you out with edge highlighting. One is a fine tip brush, which we're going to be using for 90% of miniature painting anyway, and two, paint consistency. You want it thin enough so it flows off the brush, but not so thin that it's going to splooge everywhere. But in saying that, you are going to make mistakes with this. And that's fine, it's going to happen. It doesn't matter if you've been painting for 2 days or 20 years. Flashback! But this is why we base coat with a paint that we actually have and not just a primer. So when we go back and tidy everything up, you're going to have the same finish and you won't even know it was there. This part isn't technically an edge highlight. This is really just coloring in all the trim along the shoulder pads. For this one, I'm only concentrating on the very top surfaces of the shoulder pad trim and not worrying about trying to get the little side parts that, attach to the rest of the pauldron. And then lastly, of course, the head. I generally paint the faces and heads last, so I've had time enough to warm up and kind of get used to everything. Start off easy and gradually work your way in. But it's still the same idea and same technique. Just go around. If you need to clean up, clean up. And of course, everything that we've done elsewhere, we're doing on the backpack as well. And then we end up here, Tron approved. And now we finally get to bust out the fluorescence. And this is actually the part where we made edge highlighting even worse than it had to be. Fluorescents off a brush are incredibly thin, incredibly transparent, and pretty difficult to work with. Edge highlighting is one of the most tedious techniques in all of miniature painting, so we put them together. Basically, all we're going to do is go around the model again, covering all that trim with just the fluorescence. It's the same idea and it's still pretty simple. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that we're going to have to do it somewhere between 3 and 5 times. And trust me, let everything dry before you go back and try and build up the opacity. A lot of fluorescent paints have an almost gel-like consistency, and if you don't let them dry completely and you go back, you will tear them up, you will create texture, and you will hate life for it. However, with fluorescents, the bright side, pun intended, is that because they are so thin and transparent, if you do have a little bit of spill over onto the black, it's not a big deal. And if it's noticeable to the point that you can't live with yourself if you're thinking about it there, go back in with that same black just like we did when we were edge highlighting and clean it up. The only other thing to watch for with an RGB Marine in this particular style is the placement of color. Try and keep everything in order. The order that I was working in went from pink, blue, green, yellow, orange. Try and follow along in that same succession, and then when you get to the orange, you can start all over again with the pink. And when you have different parts that are going to be intersecting, use a different starting point for the color. Example, the blue and green on the trim compared to the orange and pink on the helmet. Let's change it up. Let's do some fancy muzzle burn. Extra colors for this Marine is a little bit difficult because we're using all of the colors. So we want to try and keep things as interesting as possible on the rest of the details. After a base coat of plate mail metal, we're going to jump into a sepia tone wash. Because we're using washes and speed paints to tint the metallics, you're going to want to go back over a couple of times so it doesn't look so patchy. So just try and keep it thin and keep it even. After the sepia tone has dried, we're going in with purple swarm speed paint, and we're just going to block these colors in and smooth out the transitions later. After that, we're going in with magic blue on just the tip. Once they're all dry, you can go back and forward with each color just to make sure that there's an actual gradient and they all smooth out together. For the rest of the black details, I'm basically just going to be edge highlighting and highlighting as normal, but I don't want to go super duper high. All the details like the crests and pouches, we're starting off with deep ocean blue. And then to make our highlights, we're just going to be mixing in a little bit of company grey. Again, I don't really want these to stand out, I just want them to be done. But keep in mind, this is just for the details. We're leaving all the actual armor panels in that flat black. And that is honestly that. The technique's not difficult, it's just tedious. But it's a super interesting and unique look. But we have one more of those to do as well. Check this out. Obviously for an electric rainbow, I'm bringing out the fluorescence, but you can 100% use standard acrylics. So here's the basic pattern we're going to be doing. Yep, it's all just lines. And yes, this part is all airbrush magic. There is no way in the blue hell that I'm using fluorescence to try and paint flat armor panels to this level of opacity. But you do you. If you wanted to do that, that's fine. Just know that I am going to judge you. To make things a little bit more interesting with this, instead of just going in a straight succession all the way down the colors from the top to the bottom of the model, I've kind of put everything at a very slight angle. It just creates more interest and it's a little bit more appealing. The other thing I will mention is, even if you're using fluorescence through an airbrush, you will still have to go back with 3 or 4 coats, especially for colors like blue and orange. For yellow, I kept it down to 2 coats just so it didn't go overboard and bleed into a green. One of the big things with using fluorescence like this is they're so bright and intense that they can start to block out some detail. When planning these out, one of the most common suggestions we had for the Rainbow Road Marine style was to paint the inverse of the RGB. So we want black trim and black details. So let's try it. The only thing that kind of terrified me about this idea is any little spillover was going to be insanely difficult to try and correct. This, however, would have been an advantage if we had used standard acrylics instead of fluorescence. I'm honestly not joking, I held my breath for the vast majority of this part. Here's where things take a turn down a very grimdark path. In-games were awesome enough to send out the Villainy Inks enamel set. I hadn't tried these before, I don't use a lot of enamels, so let's just do it here. Because it was my first time using these and they are pretty thick straight out of the dropper, I started off with just the black and I thinned it down 50-50. That was probably a little bit too thin for my taste, so everything else was basically straight from the pipette. One of the advantages to using enamels is they dry fairly slowly and they actually reactivate. While everything was still wet, I threw in some Dystopian Brown and then Goons Grime. I basically just wanted to make the biggest, grittiest, grimiest mess I could. And I did that pretty easily. I managed to make some pooling, some splotches, as well as some coffee stains, which I really liked. After it's dry, it looks a little bit more like this. I'm going back in with some thinners to start wiping off some of those enamels. This is where things actually get interesting because we're going to be leaving all of that grime in the recesses where they would build up and then take off all the high points and everything that we kind of want to shine through, and all those flat panels, they're going to look a little bit cleaner again. The old painting saying is it's easier to add more later than take some away. That's really not the case when you're talking enamels. A little bit of thinner on a sponge and everything comes off pretty nicely. From here, I wanted to add some more weathering effects, so we're going to go for some chips. For this, I'm just using a little bit of black paint on an old frayed brush, and we're just going to stipple it in. Stippling is basically just dabbing it. And the weird thing is, the part that makes this all work is adding little dots of white under those black chips. These white dots make it read as though there is an actual divot in there and the light is just reflecting off the edge. Essentially, it's just an artificial edge highlight. And after the first marine, you know how to edge highlight. It might seem a bit insane that I'm going straight to pure black and pure white for this, but with the mix of colors that we have, these are probably the best two that are actually going to stand out. Now I'm going to jump into some dark rust, which is an effects paint from the Army Painter Fanatics line. This stuff has a little extra grit and a little extra texture in there, and I'm going to be using it as a mud substitute. I'm going to be adding this to all the little crannies, mostly on the feet and the bottom of the legs, where mud would build up and probably just stay there. But this is also one of those things where less is more. You don't want to just coat the entire bottom of the legs. And now, because apparently this video is just about highlighting, I'm even going to highlight the mud. This is fresh rust. It's basically the same thing, but in a lot brighter, more orange color. And after a few dabs of that, we're basically there. Rainbow Road Marine and the RGB Marine are finally done, and they're really just the beginning of an idea that I have for a Rainbow Warriors successor chapter. As always, I want to say a massive thank you to InGames, the Army Painter, and of course all of our Patreons. And if you'd like to become a member of that Patreon, there is a link in the description. And just like that, I will see you all next week when undoubtedly I have another stupid idea. Big love.